Hello, I'm Dr. Kimberly Douglas, and I am the chief contributor to this Substack, The Learning Landscape, where we are mapping 21st century learning. And usually this recording would come from our My Sunday Morning Live on TikTok. This week it is coming directly from a recording on Zoom where I am the solo party here. I am the only person here. This is being transmitted directly from me to you. And so you and I are having a conversation here. I've changed the programming on my Sunday morning live on TikTok just a little bit to really focus on the coaching aspect of my business, which I'm calling micro coaching, and I do micro lessons there. Here, I'm organizing the conversation around the learning landscape. So nothing will change. It's just that the recording you receive each week will be coming from a different source rather than the Sunday morning live on TikTok. I hope that you will stay plugged in here. This week, the theme for this week is going to be about podcast and looking at podcast as efficient learning tools. And so in mapping the learning landscape, it is about looking at all the places where learning is happening. And so when I hear conversations about illiteracy and people's inability to engage, I want to investigate that further. I want to look at where people are even if it's not the things that we think are morally or ethically correct, people are learning in these places just the same. And it's important for us as educators to really understand, to take what we would call an empirical approach, what is happening before we take and I can't think of the other thing, the normative approach, where what should be happening. So this conversation is starting from a normative point of view. What is actually happening there? If we think that there are pipelines out there, well, what that means is that people are, through various learning processes, are being moved from space to space to space to space. And there is learning happening as they're moving from those spaces. And I really hope that this is connecting with people. And I really invite you in to have conversations with me personally about this, where we can start to map this out. And eventually I'll actually want to get something down visually where we can start to map this out, where you have podcasts over here and role play games over here and traditional education over here, so that we can really get a lay of the land. And by the way, if you need somebody to come talk about this with your group and to map this out with your group, if your group wants to be part of mapping this out, by all means, please reach out to me, because I want to get this out there as much as possible. When I go to these various sites of these organizations that say that they're on the frontier of education, that they are part of the future of education, I don't hear them acknowledging where education is actually happening, all the spaces. I just hear them talking about where they're inserting things, right? And of course, I understand that because they're selling products and services, but there has to be an accounting of sorts for what this really is, rather than starting in with new solutions that are really just band-aids for what is happening out there. And this week I want to talk about formats. And I'm going to be going back and forth reading from my notes. So not formats, podcasts, I'm sorry. This week I'm going to be talking about the podcast format. And I'm going back and forth with my notes here because I'm just trying to make sure that we keep the conversation tight. But I invite you into the conversation after the recording. So if you look at the podcast format, for most part, podcast, it is set up, or the podcast setup is where you have multiple seasons. Some are short term, some are a single season, some are multiple seasons. Most podcasts have anywhere from like 7 to 10 episodes per season. There may be a theme for the season. There may not be a theme for the season. There may be a general scope for the podcast itself, or the scope may be based upon who is hosting the podcast, or the location of the podcast, or the interest area of the podcast. So there are all kinds of, and I won't get into naming, but there are all kinds of podcasts per industry. So for teachers, for futurists, for musicians, podcast about television, about movies. So there are all kinds of podcasts and they're podcasts about economics, and they're providing these venues to kind of streamline our thoughts about a particular topic or a particular set of topics. And some of these podcasts are just based on people's personalities, and just more examples are occurring to me. So it's role play games like Dungeons and Dragons, and the podcast is woven into the game. And the message I want to send here is, don't overlook this as a learning tool. If I were teaching in an institution right now, and that's always a possibility for me, I have in the past and will continue in the future, I certainly would put podcast on my syllabus, along with some other readings or videos. I, I can name 2 or 3 podcasts that I might include depending upon what course I was teaching. And so they are legitimized inside of I would legitimize them inside of academia, certainly putting it on in the past on my syllabus. I'm sorry, my stomach is growling. On my syllabi, I have included case studies from different places. Some podcasts, you're getting case studies in real time. So especially like for the business podcast or the finance podcast, you may be getting case studies in real time. And so it is legitimate to include podcasts. And we'll talk about the quality of information that you get on podcasts, because that is certainly a concern. Because I just heard a podcast yesterday where the person was, and this is where you have to listen very carefully, the person was making commentary about how private equity is destroying this country and taking over care industries. And the example that they were talking about, daycare industry, point well made. But then they went to make examples, and they made examples of daycares that are franchises. That's not the same thing as necessarily the same thing as private equity. So franchise is somebody local purchasing access to the resources that are packaged within that franchise. And so I couldn't hear the rest of their argument because their example was not aligned with the argument that we're making. Their argument is powerful, and I'm sure there are hundreds of examples that they could have pointed to, and they pointed to something, example that did not actually make the example. And so there is a quality assurance issue, but that's also part of the literacy and being educated to engage with the podcast, is being able to check that information and challenge that information when you run across inaccuracies. Okay. And I am going to pause right here and go get a snack because my stomach keeps growling. Hold on. Okay, I'm back. I feel my tummy. I'm back. I'm ready to go. No more growling. You probably couldn't hear it, but I could hear it, and it was getting on my nerves. So I'm back. Okay. And so while I was taking my food break, some thoughts occurred to me about the podcast. The example I just gave you about the person talking about private equity and then giving examples of franchises or franchisees illustrates a point that I've been making over the past few weeks. Expertise is still needed. So you have lots of content creators, you have people putting all kinds of information out there. This is not a threat to expertise. I do not feel threatened by all the content creators out there, people putting things out there. I do not feel threatened by AI because I value, and I understand that other people may not value, but I value, and I think there are lots of people who still see the value of expertise. And if you haven't thought about this or you don't see the value, I'm saying that there still is value in expertise. So having a PhD is not just about the credentials. It is a way of thinking, a way that I was taught to think about the world and the process, and to realize when I need to go get more information. And what my training and my conditioning does for me is it helps me examine things in a certain way. And so showing up in places like podcast and other platforms, my expertise is still very much needed there. My expertise is needed inside of the Substack. It has value inside the Substack. And so even as we talk about podcasts as an alternative way of educating, just know that that place, that space does not need to be void of expertise. It isn't just people yapping, right? And some of it is like some people is just people yapping, and that's all it is. But what having certain experiences or certain types of education does is it helps you be able to distinguish yapping from actual well established facts on things or established ways of thinking about things. But it also opens up the space a great deal. I just wanted to throw that in there and let you know, those of you who bring a lot of expertise, there's still space for your expertise in this landscape. And there's space to grow expertise among other people who are not considered experts yet. That's okay. It is a part of becoming. Podcast is a great developmental space. So let me stop here and just kind of go through some sources that I pulled. So here's one, and you can go to these in Google Scholar. Understanding Why Educational Professionals Engage with Podcasts is the title of this article. Understanding Why Educational Professionals Engage with Podcasts. And the subtitle is Educational Podcast Motivational Skill Development and Validation. And this is from the British Journal of Educational Technology. They identify 5 distinct motivational factors for why educators engage with educational podcasts. So information gathering, flexibility in use, social interaction, entertainment, and professional encouragement. Okay. And then in another article, the title for this article is Everyone is Listening, Podcast as an Innovative Educational Approach in Graduate Level Education. This comes from the Journal of Nursing Education, and I have found nursing to be a very progressive, innovative field of study, nursing scholarship, and also practice to be very progressive in their thinking. And one of the things that they cite here is it's a way of helping reduce screen learning time. And so, as in an effort to reduce screen learning time, faculty transitioned to a didactic critical care course to a podcast-based educational format. And they say that podcasts can be successfully incorporated into a didactic course as a content delivery modality. And they are innovating strategy for encouraging or engaging adult learners in asynchronous, distance-friendly format while continuing to meet educational objectives. So you can look at this conversation from 2 directions. Number one, putting podcast in your syllabus or as part of your programming and as a reference to inside of your syllabus or other program, your institutional or other programming. Let me get my words together. As your institutional or other programming. So that's number one. Number 2 is making the podcast itself the format for your teaching. So they're 2 different things. And it's important to understand, that podcasts are funded and staffed at different levels. So for some, it's one person doing all the work, uploading. And as a person who has done podcasting before, it is very labor intensive. And so if you have one person who's doing everything, it is quite a bit. But this could also include staffers who curate information. They put together meeting notes. I am going to be on a podcast soon, and I can tell you more about this later, where they do like podcast notes, where there's a general outline. And then, some of it is off the cuff, but there is a general outline that is supposed to guide the conversations, there to guide the conversation. So they may have curators, they may have researchers, they may have analysts, they may have producers, depending again on how well they are resourced. There are podcasts that are piped directly into closed circuit TV inside K-12 schools or through handheld device that are so-called donated to K-12 schools. And I'm talking about this not just as a person who is hosting a Substack or posting on a Substack. I'm talking about this as a person who has many years of curriculum development experience inside of higher education. So I've been an accreditation leader, so accrediting academic programs, and also a curriculum leader as well as a course developer and and deliverer of courses, design, delivery, development of courses. And I immediately, when I became familiar with the podcast format, immediately saw it as a way of teaching. And in general, what I want to encourage you to do is just think in general about what is available to you. And if you assign a podcast to your students or to your community, that you take time, first of all, to go through everything, right? And what do you want them to get from the podcast? What is it? Information? Is it knowledge? Is there a type of wisdom you want them to glean from the podcast? What discussions do you so when you are creating a course, there needs to be some knowledge and some level of knowledge and skills that people acquire. That is the purpose of your course, not just know, not just to know things or to. Um, so here we talk about the difference between teaching and learning. So if you're teaching, you're putting things out there and say, "Hey, I'm going to expose you to this. This is what you read." That's more objective based. But if you're talking about the outcomes, what are you supposed to know and what are you supposed to do when upon completing this course? And so using podcast content is no different than incorporating other content. What is it that you want them to know? But more importantly, what do you want them to be able to do as a result of interacting with this information? What kind of analysis do you want them to do? Where do you want them to apply what it is they've learned? What do you want them to be able to create? So the need to create learning outcomes does not change because we're talking about a certain format. The importance of this conversation is to recognize that there's valuable information, valuable insights that can come from podcasts, and that you definitely should seek them out, maybe curate the material, organize the material in a way that works for you. And so that it does complement your expertise and your knowledge base. Yeah. So just a little bit more about podcast. Just like any other teaching tool, they can be very helpful in making connections. And I remember I was on a very long drive with my sister one time and we listened to the NPR serial the whole time. And even to this day, that's probably been over 10 years ago. We still bond over that story. There was a lot that we learned about the criminal justice system. So it's layered. So there was a lot we learned about the criminal justice system. There was a lot we learned about like the podcast layout, how the criminal justice system looks over evidence. There's so much, and a lot about ourselves in that process. What this reminds me of is, aside from the teaching, this kind of reminds me of like Orson Welles and War of the Worlds, and people in times prior to that sitting around a campfire. And during that period, Orson Welles period, people sitting around a radio, listening to having the world broadcast. Now, I know with a lot of podcasts right now, they also come along with a video, but some of them are audio only. And that harkens back to me a time when people sat around the radio. So let me tell you, I appreciate the audio and the video, but I'm throwing this out here because I just want you to think about these things and think about how they show up for you. I appreciate multisensory education. I appreciate the opportunity to watch as well as listen. But there is something decompressing for me to just listen to an audio, because what it does is it brings things down for me. It actually allows me to hear in a way that I'm not hearing usually, because there's so many things in the environment competing for my attention. By bringing it down, it actually goes below the other stimulation. And it just makes it interesting to me in a way. And it comes and it allows me a moment to shut down the other senses so that I can receive the information. So as you are thinking about this, I really want you to think about the multisensory approach and bringing things down to a single sense. And podcasts have the capability to do that. So even if you are receiving it as a video and an audio, you can reduce it. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but you can bring it down to just the audio only. You can listen to it without watching it. Okay. And so when you're thinking about these podcasts, think about who they are, who's on them, and the guests themselves. I know Michelle Obama, I think it's called In My Opinion. She has a podcast with her brother. So regardless of what she talks about, She's the main event. She is the moment. She is the woman. And so her expertise is about being Michelle Obama. But even in, but especially in these podcasts that feature entertainers, but not, I don't say especially, but also in the podcast that feature entertainers, it's very important to check the facts. If you're going to use podcasts as teaching tools, examples that already exist, and we're not talking about ones that you would create. Yeah. The podcast illustrate a very important point in teaching is that it's more than information. It's even more than knowledge. It really is about the connection that they're able to make. And I think this is what a lot of the podcasts featuring entertainers are very effective because the entertainers are skilled in making connections in ways sometimes that we so-called experts or degreed people or credentialed people, like we don't necessarily have to make the connection. We can put the information out there, but I argue that we should try to make the connection and that teaching and learning is about connection. But there's a way that they're able to connect that I think we can absolutely learn from. And this is why I encourage people, if you don't have any credentials or skill, or I say skills or experience teaching, jump in. Don't do it blindly. Get the support, get the training. I would encourage you to work with an academic so that you all can support each other mutually, so that you're going in with best practices. And if you're charismatic and you naturally connect with people, then they can borrow from that. Um, because there's a way to do this well. There's a way to take what you have and do it well and complement the skills that the other person has. So in thinking about, we talked a little bit about podcasts that you can reference that already exist. And this part of the conversation is more so about if you want to do a podcast or you want to put something together, as you are creating, I strongly encourage you, if you're not an academic, to work with an academic. You all could just benefit each other so much. As you are going in from the very beginning, think about how another version of this podcast could be a curriculum. So you think of what you would call derivatives of it. So what can you take from what already exists and turn it into something else? Or you can plan a curriculum as you are planning. So think about these seasons. So if you decide, you know what, I can reasonably do 3 seasons. So what kind of curriculum could you lay out in those 3 seasons? What learning outcomes could come from those 3 seasons? How can you lay it out as a progression of thought? One of the simplest ways to do this and more efficient ways is to be clear on the scope of your podcast and then have a theme for each season. So what you can do is you can treat each season as like a semester or a quarter. A quarter might be easier because they're shorter, but I don't know, maybe a semester, quarter. And think about, or you can do it at summer school. If you can just do a season a year, you can just think about summer school. So you can lay it out that way. So that gives you some kind of organizing principles or gives you a structure to think about. But again, I would work with somebody that has some experience teaching. That will make your life a lot easier, life with this a lot easier. But also, when you think about your podcast, again, thinking about derivatives. So you can think about a curriculum itself. You can think about it as a course. You can think about it as an ebook, as a workbook, as a social event, as a journal, a role play game, right? And so you could use the podcast to narrate a series of challenges, a series of learning challenges. There's so much you can do. I just want to encourage you strongly to play with this, to experiment with this. Let's talk about it. There's so many ways that I can support you in this. Think about world building is something that I talk about frequently. What kind of fictional world would you like to set up, or what kind of world can you imagine for the future? If you're doing something on futurism and you're thinking about how you can set up systems for people, you can talk your way through this through a podcast. And I am not, and I'm talking mainly to people who are already thinking. about podcasts. I'm not encouraging you to run out and do anything, but if you are thinking about this, just know that there are many creative ways that you can do this. I encourage you to really think about what your resources are, what you have access to, what is required. One of the most important things is to understand what all goes into producing a podcast. And if you're putting out podcast episodes every week, there's uploading, there's downloading, there's labeling, there's captioning, there's transcribing, there's all kinds of accessibility issues, because if you're going to do it at this point, there's so many tools, you may as well do it well. There's so many tools to make it accessible to people that you may as well do it well. So again, just to recap, I've talked about this from the point of view of inserting a reference to an existing podcast, but also talking about what kind of podcast you would like to create as well, and how you could, from the jump, set that up as a curriculum, or set it up as an ebook or a workbook or a social activity or a journal. The other thing about doing a podcast is, if you have any kind of viewership at all, if even you have 5 people, one of the things that is really magical is the feedback that you get from people. So listener viewer input can be very powerful in letting you know whether you're on the right track or not, and whether or not people are learning something from your podcast. Yeah. So you can do any number of things. You can help people with English as second language. You could, you got the famous platforms like Duolingo and Rosetta Stone. You can sort of bypass that, or you can incorporate some of their tools. You can bypass that by giving people a different way to engage. If you work with autistic children, you could do, I think they call storyboards inside of a podcast, right? Since you now have the visuals that go along with the audio. There's so many things that you can do. And I'm going to start to wrap up here and just recap that you can include existing podcasts. Like, of course, that's the easiest strategy. And really understanding what they offer you, understand the landscape, doing this is curation. This is curating what currently exists. But then also you may be interested in creating your own podcast. So one of the things that I want to add to what I was talking about earlier is, you can do multiple seasons, multiple episodes, but you also think about the length of each episode. If you can only do 5 minutes, then you do 5 minutes. If you can do 10 minutes per episode, or you do 20 minutes per episode, do that. I know people who are doing these short audio clips, and it is working for them. It is absolutely working for them. The thing is to understand the resources that are available to you. Of course, putting together a podcast is a longer haul. It's more planning, it's more organization. It just requires more of you. And it requires, what it also requires is that you make the right connections you make connections with the right people to lighten your load. And so that you have the kind of product, you have the kind of delivery that you're interested in making. So now you're talking about creating a whole community around a production. So that's one thing. But of course, if you are looking to include things that already exist, that is about a type of curation and recognizing what is out there. So that is also a type of organization, but that's something you can do more efficiently by yourself, even though you don't have to, but you can include it in your syllabus or any kind of programming that you have. And don't lose sight of what your original programming is, right? Because your programming is not the podcast. That's their podcast. Your program should be, what is the word I'm trying to say? Enhanced by anything a podcast offer you. And I wouldn't just list a bunch of podcasts. That's not good curation. I would probably list specific episodes and do some notes about why this specific episode is important. Because the thing is, and I've had this experience many times where somebody sends me a video, or they send me like an episode or YouTube or something like that, and they had one thing in mind that they wanted me to look at, and then I saw it and I saw something totally different, because my direction went to the thing that's the most important to me. So, when I suggest that podcast, identify that podcasts are part of this learning landscape, important part of this learning landscape. And I suggest that you think about how you can incorporate it into your curriculum. I'm not saying just grab something and throw it in there. I'm saying that you have to create a well curated experience, even if this information, just as you would with academic articles, you're not going to just throw you may just throw an academic article without context, but provide the context, direct people's attention to what you saw, unless you're deliberately like withholding information or kind of not withholding, but holding back on information. That's different. But take them where what got you there, why you chose this thing to include here in this conversation. They can be amazing tools if curated well. You can create an amazing tool through a podcast if you curate well, because that is still, even including the information in the podcast, is a type of curation. It absolutely is curation, except that you're bringing things together in an original way, that in ways that other people have not thought about. Let me know if you want to talk about this more. I want to keep talking about this. We'll talk about this throughout the week. So what will happen is I will post this video that you're watching now. It's posted, and I take the transcript notes and then I put them into an AI generator and help get them to organize my thoughts from this conversation. And then I kind of craft an essay, or not kind of, I craft an essay from that may mimic this discussion, but may take it in a slightly different direction. Because a lot of times what happens is when I see these notes, it prompts other thoughts, like it sparks other thoughts. Then on Wednesday, I do so there's an essay from the notes on Tuesday. Then on Wednesday, I do a reading of the essay, so presented in a different modality, and I may add something to that. And then on Thursdays, we do our the Black Women Trends list. So that is the week, or from week to week, that is the formula. Okay. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that you have as well. Continue mapping the learning landscape. Please, as you go away from these conversations, you go away from this video, from these essays, really think about what the learning landscape looks like for you. Gaming, YouTubes, TikToks, courses, ebooks, workbooks, learning platforms, learning management systems, podcast, other types of broadcast. What is this learning landscape and how is it shaping up? What is the emerging landscape? That's what we're doing here in this space. And today I'm saying there's a part of it I want you to focus on. And the part I want you to focus on for this week is podcast. So bring the conversation, bring the commentary. Let me know what you're thinking about podcast, because everything changed for me when I started listening to podcasts. Things just felt so much more accessible and condensed and laid out a lot more clearly for me through podcast. I want to know if that's your experience, and I want to know where you think this is headed and what podcast will tell me that. What do you think podcast will look like a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now? Okay. I'm Dr. Kimberly Douglas. I'm the chief contributor to this Substack, The Learning Landscape. And thank you for indulging my food break. And let's keep this going. We're mapping this out. Let's map this out together. Take care. Goodbye.